Okay, I'm kicking off with a talk called As Freedom as a Breakfast Food, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Haplessness. The title of this digressive consideration of our subject matter comes from three separate sources. The first is drawn from a poem by E. E. Cummings, which begins, "As freedom is a breakfast food, or truth can live with right and wrong, or molehills are from mountains made, long enough and not so long will being pay the rent of seam," etc. And he wrote that poem in the 1920s, and it seemed to me quite prescient. The second half of the title takes a much quoted and frequently and sometimes deliberately misunderstood phrase from the Declaration of Independence of 1776. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men," sorry about the gendered language, "among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And finally, a quote from William H. White, whose 1956 study of management methods, The Organization Man, used to be quite influential. "We are not hapless beings, caught in the grip of forces we can do little about, and wholesale damnations of our society only lend a further mystique to organization. Organizations have been made by, sorry, gendered language again, made by man and can be changed by man." What I hope to convey by this mashup as a starting point is that we have witnessed a sea change in our view of liberty since the 1770s, or E. Cummings' 1920s, or even the 1950s of White, who was writing, we should add, at the high point of the McCarthy witch hunts, a process to which Cummings himself provided a glad support, ardent support. On the one hand, it seems to me that we are far more hapless as a society than we were even in the 1950s, in spite of the many movements that now exist to pursue the rights of previously disenfranchised communities, with all the implications of single-issue politics that such communities tend to bring. The majority of citizens in our post-industrial but still heavily enclosed societies are, or sometimes choose to feel, powerless. For example, to affect environmental change, or to close the ever-widening wealth gap. Having abandoned hope, such hapless folk then content themselves, sometimes quite guiltily, with the toys that consumerism has to offer, and frequently markets under the banner of some catchy but utterly bogus message of personal freedom. By contrast, those who shout loudest about their rights, the current shorthand being Karen on the one side and woke or SJW on the other, are inclined to overlook the key idea expressed in the Constitution, an idea that goes back to the levelers in 17th century England, that such rights are not simply granted, but must be secured. Secured, that is, by vigilance, self-education, and most of all, by what, in his study of the U.S. education system, Excellent Sheep, the miseducation of the American elite, William Dereshevich, I hope I said that right, calls disciplined dissidence, which cannot be measured against any rod or any curriculum. There are citizens for whom the notion of freedom as a right, whether in society or as an individual basis, has in effect become a commodity or a political fetish. They may or may not be deliberate bad actors, but their main fault is that they have forgotten the relationship between liberty and responsibility, and that any freedom anyone might win is entirely predicated on understanding that responsibility. And if I might take the opportunity here to draw an etymologically compromised distinction between liberty on the one hand and freedom on the other, I want to say that they are missing a basic point. Enshrined in classical political philosophy, that there is a significant difference between the liberty afforded by just laws and the freedom that civil liberties permits the individual to develop. As Emerson says, freedom is not the right to live as we please, but the right to find how we ought to live in order to fulfill our potential. And if I may be permitted a few more pithy quotes from my commonplace book, this idea is further elaborated by Eleanor Roosevelt. Freedom makes a huge requirement of every human being. With freedom comes responsibility. For the person who is unwilling to grow up, this is a frightening prospect. And it is rather nicely extended by Sebastian Junger in his excellent 2021 book, appropriately entitled Freedom, the idea that we can enjoy the benefits of society while owing nothing in return is literally infantile. Only children owe nothing. In short, I want to say that while it is a basic political necessity that we work to win and maintain our civil liberties, these are only a basis for freedom and not freedom itself. If we allow ourselves to confuse the liberties of a just society affords by law, what we might call following Isaiah Berlin, I don't know if people know, is a distinction between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from is negative freedom, and the freedom that is informed, grown-up, radically responsible citizen enacts freedom to, or positive freedom. We are, to return to Emerson, in danger of the flippant mistaking for freedom of some paper preamble like a Declaration of Independence or the statute right to vote. And they are typical of those who have never dared to think and act. To offer a practical instance, the right to vote is, or should be, a civil liberty guaranteed by a democratic government. But this decision on how she votes is the responsibility of every free citizen. This freedom depends upon remaining informed, making judgment calls, refusing to be hoodwinked by media or other biases, and where necessary, exercising disciplined dissidence. To fall short of these responsibilities is to become one of the hapless, sacrificing the possibility of freedom for a mere ideology or the pretty lullabies of a comforting tyranny, the enclosure of corporate consumerism, for example, or quite simply for an easy life. Just don't think about it. I don't believe it's necessary here to point out that freedom is not a breakfast food. All too often, however, our freedom, with the emphasis on our, and the governments we have instituted to secure civil liberties have been sold to us in much the same way as cereals and detergents. as have invasions, intrusive levels of surveillance, and targeted campaigns against minority groups and dissidents. See war on drugs, for example. We can have some fun remembering the crudest examples of food-related rebranding to reinforce the free world, God on our side mentality. For example, during World War I, sauerkraut was renamed freedom cabbage in the United States during the First World War. And we all remember the rebranding of French fries as freedom fries when France refused to join George Bush's war against Iraq. But the history of representing freedom as a commodity, or as the inevitable byproduct of a commodity, has not always been so obvious or so visible. Going back to the 1920s, when Cummings was making his breakfast food comparison, a PR man named Edward Bernays, who just happened to be Sigmund Freud's nephew, was teaching corporations, quote, how they could make people want things they didn't need by systematically linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. This comes from, the quote comes from the wonderful documentary series by Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self. Everyone should watch it. And in the century since then, the business of making people want things they don't need has become an advanced science. In fact, the selling of supposed freedoms is rife. As copywriter and creative strategist, I love that title, copywriter and creative strategist. I'd like to be a creative strategist. Neil Sood notes in a recent blog he put out called Selling Freedom, How Brands Sell Freedom. In our industry, we often have to sell freedom to people. On behalf of companies large and small, the freedom of the open air, the freedom of choice, or the freedom of challenging the status quo. So how do we sell freedom? We humans seek freedom like Love Islanders seek attention. I'm glad some of you got that reference. I have no idea what it means. But it sounded good. And he continues, in a society where people often feel unmoored from time and community, freedom has become a product. And he continues, we want escape, to disconnect from the everyday. We want rebellion, to fight for a just cause. We want meaning, to feel a part of something larger. And the entire point of advertising is to give people what they want. And of course, neither advertising nor the corporations they serve can give us freedom. But they can sell us any number of illusions. And enough of us fall for those illusions that the prophets soar. Community, self-reliance, blissful solitude, belonging, even rebellion are the copywriter's manna. Sood again. We consume the idea of anti-corporate rebellion even when it's hand-fed to us by those very same corporations. Think of any recent movies, TV shows, or ads that you've seen. The Marlboro Man bravely eking out an existence on the American frontier. Then the Star Wars, where the forces of good rebel against the evil empire brought to us by the Disney empire. You've got Amazon's The Boys with their message of corporate irresponsibility brought to you by Jeff Bezos. Every day we consume illusions. Sometimes we are wryly self-aware about it. We even watch documentaries on Netflix about runaway algorithms and the corporate enclosure of our imaginations. But in 2021, British consumers still spent an average of 4 hours per day on their mobile devices. In 2022, a mega influencer on YouTube could command around $20,000 per post. Do we not see that they're doing it for the money? According to the watchdog organization Media Matters, Fox News viewers are subjected to a constant barrage of lies, misleading statements, and half-truths as the network's hosts, guests, and other personalities weave a comprehensive web of misinformation. But I'm going to stop there because I don't want to bang on like a grumpy old man. And as my children tell me, Jeremiads are out of fashion. They tell me that a lot. So I don't want to speak about that anymore. I'm sure you can fill in all of the gaps of what I've just left out to do with misinformation, disinformation, etc. Rather than banging on in this way, I want to talk in a very specific mode or sense about love. However, before I launch into what may sound like a very odd digression, let me just say that I'm not talking about love as an emotion, as one loves one's children, say, or pine woods, or Bach's French suites, or the ultimate human achievement, the game of basketball. What I want to talk about here is love as a way of knowledge, an attitude, and the particular method of navigating the world. In the first of the Canterbury Tales, the tale of the night, anybody who went through the English education system hates the night because they were 15 at the time and they had no idea what this poem was about. But it's actually a great poem. Geoffrey Chaucer describes how this world is ordered. I'm going to say it in modern English. The first mover of the cause above, when that he made the fair chain of love, great was the effect, and high was his intent. Well knew he why, and what thereof he meant. For with that fairer chain of love he bonds the fire, the air, the water, and the land. In certain bounds, that they may not flee. Here he is echoing Boethius, whose work he translated, drawing directly on a passage in the Constellation of Philosophy that he renders as, all this accordance of things is bounden with love. The word Chaucer is translating here is as love is the Latin word amor, that is love in the widest sense, including love of family, love, romantic love, etc. Even love of basketball, presumably. Latin also has the word delectio, which means respect mostly, I guess, and caritas, which has a richer etymology than we usually think of these days, but most of us know it from St. Paul, from 1 Corinthians 13. I'll let you bring that back to mind. So, charity never faileth. God, I can't remember myself. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, they shall vanish away. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as I also am known. And these abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. This is, to be sure, a particular use of the word charity in English, in which the King James translators attempt to convey Paul's Greek term, agape, which Liddell and Scott, a standard reference book, define as love, especially brotherly love, charity, the love of God for man, and of man for God. However, without wishing to dive down any further etymological rabbit holes, what I would like to emerge from this is first a sense that love is the original ordering principle, whether it be God's love in any of the major monotheisms, or some other force, my own preference being for primary consciousness that, according to some recent researchers, manifests some, but not all of its characteristics, using the brain as a filter. I think we might get into that in terms of discussion. And second, that this love is or can be echoed here on earth, so to speak, in human relations. But to make the possibility, we need to learn how to be free in the positive freedom to sense, which means to live in the given world, that is, with contingency, and freely respond to that world, the quotidian world, the everyday, by having, not to escape it, but in a way that moment by moment redeems it. Here is Annie Dillard reflecting on the words of Martin Buber. You cannot mend the chromosome, quell the earthquake, or staunch the flood. You cannot atone for the dead tyrant's murders, and you alone cannot stop living tyrants. As Martin Buber saw it, the world of ordinary days affords us that precise association with God that redeems both us and our speck of world. God entrusts and allots to everyone an area to redeem this creased and feeble life. Quote Buber, the world in which you live just as it is and not otherwise. Insofar as he cultivates and enjoys them in holiness, he saves souls. He who prays and sings in holiness eats and speaks in holiness. Through him, the sparks which have fallen will be uplifted, and the worlds which have fallen will be delivered and renewed. This is rather wonderful, not least as a way of thinking about the vexed question of free will. How better to envisage freedom than this idea that we are each allotted a speck of world to redeem? Such a vision for Heidegger is of essence of dwelling. Quote Heidegger, Building Dwelling Thinking. The basic character of dwelling is to spare, to preserve. Mortals dwell in the way they preserve the fourfold in its essential being, its presencing. Mortals dwell in that they save the earth. Saving does not mean snatching something from danger. To save really means to set something free into its own presencing. To save the earth is more than to exploit it or even wear it out. Saving the earth does not master the earth and does not subjugate it, which is merely one step away from spoliation. Bearing all this in mind, we might return to Emerson's remark, quoted earlier, that freedom is not the right to do as we please, but the right to find out how we ought to live. And perhaps starting to absorb the notion that freedom, too, does not consist in rights, as freedom from does, but rather that freedom consists of being our own, of living our own responsibilities in our own speck of world. We might also be inclined to expand our sense of positive freedom to include the intention of fulfilling not only our own potential, but the potential of all things. We might see this as a particular instance of the idea of freedom in the words of Lama Yeshe Losal Rinpoche, is inseparable from responsibility. If I have the freedom to think, it is my responsibility to think positively. If I have the freedom to speak, it is my responsibility to speak properly and meaningfully. If I have the freedom to act, it is my responsibility to act correctly. Nobody else can take that decision for me. This is not to say that liberty, freedom from, is not essential. With the exception of heroes and saints, we require a modicum of negative freedom, i.e., those rights that governments are instituted among men to take our first steps towards positive freedom. However, as Thomas Paine himself said, the work of government of laws is to, quote, restrain our vices. That is, to try to protect the virtuous, the convivial, and the vulnerable from the malice or rapacity of those who have not yet learned to be free. In short, liberty, freedom from, is a matter of common sense. Freedom to, on the other hand, demands an imaginative leap, informed by disciplined dissidence, radical responsibility, and a refusal to be hapless. To conclude, this is my final thought, on top of the idea of liberty as freedom from, freedom as freedom to. The next step, I think, is spontaneity. The freedom to allows us to prepare for and begin to enjoy the spontaneity that, for example, we find in art or sports. Spontaneity is the way in which we find grace. We can't find grace without spontaneity. This is a quality we often represent these days as you be you, or Nike's admonition to just do it, as if you could buy a pair of shoes and just start, running 9-second, 100 yards and things like that. These are also illusory. There may be a spontaneous self hidden in each of us, but we are compromised by a lifelong program of socialization, adjustment, disinformation, and sometimes loving miseducation into being reliable workers and consumers with just enough invested in the apple cart not to upset it. To become positively free, to become spontaneous, we have to unlearn what we were taught and uncover, by a process of psychic archaeology, the spontaneous self buried underneath all that conformist apparatus. My own contention is that once we find this buried treasure, the true gold of the alchemists, we will recognize its connection to the primary consciousness, the informing energy of all this accordance of things. In short, what Chaucer, Boethius, and so many of our predecessors called love. Thanks, and sorry for the stumbling delivery. I have to go and see an eye surgeon, I think. Thanks, everyone.